Before we begin, I want to take this moment to acknowledge that the Canadian Centre for Study of Co-operatives, all of us here in Saskatoon, are located on Treaty 6 territory. And this is the traditional homeland of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis. We're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its bounty, reflect on its beauty, and reaffirm our commitment to the shared, necessary, and important reconciliation, both in universities and in the cooperative sector. And as you're going to see today, this talk that you're going to hear from Candice is in some ways, importantly, anchored around this work of reconciliation and holding ourselves and each other to account in that process. I'll say a bit more about Candice's talk in a minute, and she's going to say a lot more about it. But I want to kind of make sure we underline that. And then I want to say a few words about the Fredeen Scholarship. This scholarship, if you've joined us in years past, you'll know that this talk and the scholarship are in honor of Hartley and Margaret Fredeen and their long-standing commitment to cooperatives. The family was greatly influenced by growing up in a pioneering community where cooperation meant not only a way of life, but a necessary condition for life. And I still think that's true. I just don't think we see it quite as obviously as we used to, but it's still core to all that we do as humans. And so I think the family want to honor that tradition, but also the close ties that Hartley and Margaret had to the University of Saskatchewan. They were both graduates of this university. They were awarded the Alumni Award of Achievement in '97. And I think just to have that long kind of relationship with the university. In fact, since 2004, the family has supported this scholarship so that University of Saskatchewan can support students who want to do research on cooperatives. So I want to just, again, like I have in years past, sincerely thank the Fredeen family for their support of this scholarship, the next generation of cooperative researchers, scholars, and leaders. It really does make a difference, I can tell you firsthand. So with that, I'd like to introduce at least one member of the Fredeen family. I know we have Art here today. I'm not sure if Shirley is here, but Art, would you like to say a few words before I kind of throw things to Candice? So welcome.
Yeah, I'll keep it fairly brief. I don't have anything planned, but yeah, we were really affected by our parents, and in a good way, I think. Always, even within the family, things being very cooperative, and we all had credit union accounts and shopped only at the co-op. And yeah, I won't say too much. Mom just passed away last December, right at the very end of December of last year, and so yeah, we're still interesting. Even if you have a mother that lives over 100 years old, you still have that that feeling of loss, but the moral compass, I think, and is still very strong in the family, and yeah, even though most of us are only my sister Shirley is living in Saskatoon, but think of Saskatoon often. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Art. That's a powerful legacy. I mean, we talk about the scholarship, but that kind of that moral anchor, I personally aspire to that with my children. I'm not sure how effective I am, but I aspire to. So thank you for that. So yeah. Just some formalities for folks on the call. For the talk, we'd ask you to mute yourself, turn off your camera for the presentation. When we come back for the question and answer period, you can turn things back on, at least the camera part. If you have any questions during the talk, you can use the chat function on Zoom to put those down in the Q&A part of things. After Candice has done her talk, you can use that as well. And you can also maybe raise your hand and we could call on you to verbalize your questions if you choose. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu also via our chat function in Zoom, and he'll help you out. So with that, those housekeeping details out of the way, and nice warm words from Art, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Candice Minott. She is the recipient of last year's Fredeen Scholarship. She was also my graduate student, so I have a special attachment to Candice's talk today. This fall, Candice completed her Master's of Public Policy at the School of Public Policy here in Saskatchewan. It was only last week, in fact, that Candice walked across the stage to receive her degree. So we're so proud of her and her congratulating her accomplishments. Candice is also an active and passionate cooperator. So prior to joining our policy school 2 or 3 years ago, I think, or 4 years ago, Candice was the branding and marketing manager at Jamaican National, or JN Bank. This is the first member-owned bank in Jamaica, and then she became a senior manager of branding and marketing with the JN Group. And currently, Candice is the community engagement coordinator at Cooperatives First, an organization that was spun out of the center from some research we did about almost 10 years ago. For folks who aren't familiar with the Cooperatives First, they're a nonprofit organization dedicated to cooperative development across Western Canada. So in that role, Candice has been supporting development not-for-profit childcare cooperative centers across Saskatchewan. This could be a subject of another talk, but that's not what she's going to talk about today. Like the spirit and legacy established by the Fredeens, Candice shares the same commitment to cooperation, serving, and supporting communities, and helping folks, work together to solve their problems and enrich their lives. So as I hinted at earlier, Candice is going to share some findings of her research project, which uses 2 credit unions in Saskatchewan as case studies to explore how we can think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and particularly call to action number 92, as a form of public policy known as moral suasion. I understand from Candice, she's going to emphasize upweight that moral suasion part of things. So that's going to be kind of understand from Candice, the focus of her talk. And I'm really looking forward to it. Candice, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marc-Andre, and thank you everyone for joining today. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Fredeen family and Mr. Fredeen Art, who is here representing the family, for their vision for supporting this scholarship. And, emerging scholars like myself, we're so grateful for this support and for their continued support. I also would like to thank again my supervisor, Professor Marc-Andre, for his support, for challenging me with this topic, and also for my colleagues at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives, my colleagues at Cooperatives First, who have provided me with constant encouragement and inspiration as well. I'd like to also acknowledge my own mom and dad who are present here. My mom worked with the credit union sector in Jamaica, so she has been a big inspiration in the work that I do as well. So I just want to acknowledge them. And also to my peers, my fellow JSGS classmates, alumni who are present here as well. So today I will be presenting the findings of my thesis research. I have put moral suasion at the center for this talk because it is a major part of this study, and as we are a policy school, I want to share some more awareness about moral suasion. So, Stan, if you could start for me. Thank you. So, moral suasion, as described by Romans, is the use of ethical and normative appeals to influence voluntary behavior without legal force. So moral suasion is what we would call a soft policy tool. And because there's this voluntary element, this voluntary action that it commands, it relies basically on a shared value system, and it encourages choice through this. So it really appeals to an individual's sense of right and wrong. And for the collective, for the community, there's a sense of responsibility and a shared collective moral obligation that this particular policy tool really instigate. So it originated through central banks and has later been adopted by various sectors, including banking, across health, across really a lot of areas that we wouldn't even think of, even environmental policy. It has also been used historically by the abolitionist movement and also to shape truth and reconciliation commissions globally. Next. Thanks, Dan. So this is a representation of some well-known policy tools. When you compare moral suasion to these other traditionally, I would say, well-known policy instruments, we have ranked them here as it relates to their use of force or use of coercion. Many of you are familiar with nudges, and this is more of a manipulation of choice, and also information-based educational initiatives which appeal to reasoning. So moral suasion is pretty distinct in, as I had mentioned before, there is a voluntary element there. And it encouraged the decision makers to participate in this ethical responsibility or ethical choice. And it is an avenue, I would say, that can be used by policymakers to build legitimacy, trust, and cooperation as well. Next slide. Now, looking at how policymakers have used moral suasion, central banks have used it in terms of formal regulation. Policymakers tend to use it because it is a tool that is adaptable, especially when formal regulation is impractical and when swift behavioral change is needed. So with central banks, they would use it to signal their expectations to influence either market lending or market activity without having to change policy rates. It's used in consumer protection, also in corporate governance, and also across public health campaigns. Now, in crisis situations, as we would have seen in COVID-19, moral suasion was used here to almost create a stabilizing force throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And it can also help in terms of financial crisis as well, where institutions are required to coordinate their efforts in a responsible way. Next slide. So looking at some of the advantages and risks of moral suasion. Now, moral suasion, as I mentioned before, it is a low-cost, flexible tool. It builds cooperation, and it often acts as a precursor to regulation, such as taxes and other hard policy tools. Moral suasion, however, is not without its limitations. It can carry some threats as it relates to future regulation, and sometimes actors respond unevenly to compliance efforts. Its effectiveness and credibility can affect the policymaker. When trust is low, moral appeals tend to lose their power. And, one of the key things as it relates to reconciliation that we have to bring out as well, because it is not a binding approach and it lacks these enforcement mechanisms, it can result in symbolic or superficial actions. And this can undermine trust as well. Next slide. So you may ask, how does this relate to the cooperative sector? Now, cooperative institutions have inherent values, and this provides an interesting study for examining how moral suasion will operate within values-based institutions. Now, cooperatives are known for being grounded in democracy, equality, solidarity, and these values reinforce organizational practices and policies. And they may create favorable conditions for reconciliation-oriented initiatives. So this piqued our interest, and we wanted to really dig further into this to see how moral suasion would be presented when cooperative institutions are faced with implementing some of these measures. What we know is that values alone may be insufficient to create ethical long-term change. Next slide. This can be seen with how moral suasion operates with truth commissions. Worldwide, truth commissions have been used to appeal to the social consciousness of communities. However, research has shown that there are some limits in how this is really implemented and how it is constrained. Even though it was used heavily with the abolitionist movement, it also showed that without legal and political action, systematic change may not happen. Next slide, Stan. Thank you. So giving you some insight here into the Canadian context. Now, this study is rooted in Canada's ongoing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And the Canadian Indian residential school system, which operated from the early 1800s to 1997, is one in which has created almost a scourge on Canadian history. The first residential school opened in 1828 and the last one closed in 1997. Now, with this system, it was primarily established with the goal of assimilating Indigenous children into European Canadian culture. And in Saskatchewan alone, there were over 20 residential schools. Now, with a significant Indigenous population, and we can see that in 2022, the Indigenous population in Saskatchewan was over 187,000 persons, that this community would have been affected negatively by this system, which would have created many harms to Indigenous peoples. Next slide. Out of the atrocities that were reported, there came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. And one of the elements of the agreement was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation report. And this came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, and this provided a framework to advance reconciliation across sectors in Canada. Specifically, Call to Action 92 asks the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, commit to meaningful consultation, provide equitable job opportunities for Indigenous peoples, and educate their staff on Indigenous rights and history. And it's important to note that in 2016, Canada affirmed UNDRIP, and this in itself was an important signal to both the federal institutions and to Canadian business sector at large, that this was an important element for them to take some action on. Next slide. For the credit union sector, the Canadian Credit Union Association followed up in 2018, where its delegates passed unanimously a resolution that encouraged credit unions to adopt TRC number 92 and UNDRIP. Now, this call was an ethical appeal or a moral ask There were no legal repercussions, fines, or incentives. It was just a request on ethical and moral grounds. So, because credit unions are values-driven, community-based financial institutions, the thinking is that this would be synonymous with them really adopting these principles and being some of the forerunners to implementing TRC number 92. Now, we can see as a membership, the credit union sector is quite significant with over 188 credit unions in over 1,630 locations. So pretty significant and impactful if it is that this had some type of influence on the sector as a whole. Next slide. So for my research, we looked at two questions. One, do we observe evidence that Saskatchewan Credit Unions operationalize TRC number 92 and UNDRIP in their practices and policies? And second, under what conditions is moral suasion or ethical appeals an effective or useful policy tool? Next. So for this study, I used a qualitative case study design, and I looked at a time-based comparison between 2016, which was pre this CCUA resolution, and 2022, which was post the CCUA resolution. And looking at two distinct credit unions, Affinity Credit Union, urban-based credit union, and Synergy Credit Union, which is primarily rural-based. I conducted 6 semi-structured interviews, and I used a visual research method called photo elicitation in my interviews as well, and came up with some very interesting findings. Next. So as it relates to Affinity Credit Union, Affinity's reconciliation work was very outward in its approach because of their involvement with the Global Alliance of Banking on Values, which is an international organization focused on ethical banking practices. They were exposed to UNDRIP and were really prompted to make some inroads here and be the leaders in a domestic collaboration with Assiniboine and Van City credit unions. And this led to the 3 organizations co-authoring the 2018 CCUA resolution. So they brought this resolution to the member organization and encouraged other credit unions to adopt the TRC and UNDRIP principles. And as an early adapter, the complement that they were able to provide to these initiatives was that they could build relationships with Indigenous communities and establish various relationships as well. So they tried to really integrate all of these initiatives into their banking strategy. So they developed an Indigenous engagement strategy. They also embedded reconciliation principles in their environmental, social, and governance strategy. And they also created a reconciliation roadmap. With the various mergers, they were able to learn from other credit unions that were acquired along the way, and this shaped their response. And operationally, they were really focused on ensuring that across marketing, HR, and other departments, that their policies and their practices had integrated these Indigenous frameworks. Next slide. Now, this is an example of an initiative by Affinity Credit Union. Many of you may know this is a Rock Your Roots Walk that happens here in Saskatoon. And as an organization, they were very reflective in terms of using and really showcasing and highlighting their participation in this activity. And what they did was consult with Indigenous elders before putting this out in their annual report and to the public. And one of the things that came away from my discussions with them is that they indicated that one, there was a struggle there. One, they had consultation with Indigenous elders, and on their request, they encouraged them to highlight their participation because they wanted the world to know who their allies were. So for the team at Affinity, they recognized that reconciliation was not a branding opportunity. However, they wanted to be an ally, and with the support of Indigenous elders, they were able to highlight their banner and also walk with their banner to show that they were an ally as well. Next slide. So as it relates to Affinity, as mentioned before, Affinity, because it is an urban-based institution and all of these mergers that took place, it really stood on one of its key principles as an institution, its cooperative values. And they also showed that in terms of their institutional capacity, that they were able to take on more activities, both on a national level. Synergy Credit Union really looked at taking a more grassroots approach to reconciliation. And their engagement was led primarily by leadership who themselves immersed in engagements with local Indigenous-led organizations. They went forward with various initiatives on an operational level, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And they also had training internally with the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course for their staff. They also made some outreach to communities as well that are specifically Indigenous communities and showed support there. And they wanted to build relationship. So in terms of the usefulness of moral suasion, we can see that cooperative values aligned really well here. And in terms of voluntary action from leadership right down to staff, they were very, very moved, not only by what was happening within the Canadian landscape with the Truth and Reconciliation, but also by their leaders who motivated them. Next slide, Stan. Thank you. So with Synergy Credit Union, as mentioned before, engagement was driven by both survivor testimony heard from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Heart of Treaty 6 Reconciliation group. Because there was this grassroots effort, the employee training and staff-led Indigenous engagement initiatives helped to drive reconciliation activities and building trust over time with Indigenous communities. They have seen gradual changes both to their policies and their practices. Next slide. Out of my discussions with the group as well, this photo was one that was very emotional in terms of recognizing that within the town of Lloydminster itself, there had been some division there with Indigenous communities. This specific activity was an inter-school powwow, and it was the first time that this was happening in Lloydminster. And one of the participants indicated that in their lifetime, they had never seen anything like this happening. And they visibly saw elders weeping because prior to this, these types of activities could not happen. They were outlawed by Indian agents in the town of Lloydminster. So this photo itself brought out a very emotional response from participants and also served as a reminder that there are real consequences and affected persons that really were greatly affected by this segregation. Next slide. So, in terms of moral suasion's usefulness, from the study, respondents showed that the truth and reconciliation for them was the greatest moral catalyst. It made them aware of some of the atrocities that were happening. And from there, they were prompted to respond to say, how do I learn more? How do I improve? How do I support Indigenous activities? Leadership in these organizations also helped in terms of strategy and commitment. They themselves indicated in my interviews that they were really focused on getting themselves educated before going to staff with initiatives. And they felt that cooperative values were synonymous with Indigenous values, and they felt a moral imperative to act. So, in terms of moral suasion, we can see here where even though there was no legal force, that there was some prompting that happened, and persons on an ethical basis were able to move from just bystanders to participants to actively creating policies and practices that supported Indigenous frameworks. One of the key things that came out as well is that symbolic actions serve as entry points. There were many participants who were hesitant and almost unsure of how to approach the topic of reconciliation. And in themselves, they thought some of their actions may be symbolic. However, it was important for them to start their reconciliation journey. And in that, the findings showed that symbolic gestures can initiate meaningful engagement, and if there is continuity, can really affect change. Next slide. So, in terms of policy relevance, the study highlights that moral suasion, particularly within cooperative institutions, when supported by organizational values and leadership commitments, can catalyze voluntary involvement without having regulatory mechanisms. Policies like this are rooted in relationship building and trust. So, especially when you have policies that require relationship building and trust, moral suasion is a policy tool that should be looked at to strengthen practices and also to bring legitimacy to policy objectives. In terms of the research itself, one key ethical limitation I would have to put forward is the absence of Indigenous participants. The focus of the study was on how institutions operationalize TRC and UNDRIP, and more research is required to include the perspectives of Indigenous members and staff. And this case study provides a great contrast between two cases, one urban and one rural, and they offer valuable comparative insights. However, in terms of generalization, we need to do more research in the cooperative sector to see what can apply. However, as moral suasion has this voluntary element, there is no one size fits all to the operationalization of policies and practice as it relates to Indigenous frameworks. But these two organizations provide, I would say, a great example of how organizations can take away, adopt to their own culture, and also move forward to implement policies and practices to support Indigenous frameworks. Next slide. So thank you all for listening to this talk, and I invite your questions at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Candice. I've seen the presentation many times, but this was good. It was like really smooth. Like you nailed it. That was great. I want to open it up for questions. As I mentioned earlier, you can put them in chat, or if you want to raise your hand and we can just mute yourself, we can go that way as well. So I'm just going to see monitor for hand raises and questions in chat. While we're waiting for a question, Candice, and I feel like I've asked all the questions I could possibly ask, but I'm going to ask one more. What would your advice be to policymakers? You know, I've done this study. You've thought about this kind of policy tool called moral suasion. If a policymaker were kind of setting out their range of tools for, you know, analysis of a given issue, what would you say they should know about moral suasion as a policy tool?
Thanks, Professor. I think that's a great question. Moral suasion in policy making, it's so nuanced and unique in terms of it really requires that ethical ask. I think it's very subjective in terms of where it's implemented. You know, you do have some countries and some communities who have a higher level, I would say, of social responsibility and also see themselves as beneficiaries of the social good. So it really requires for the policymaker, one, to have a good understanding of the landscape in which they're trying to enact this policy, and also in terms of using various methods then to implement, because in itself, being a voluntary tool, it may not have lasting effects. However, if there are short-term measures that are required, whether it be a crisis situation or it can be paired with other, I would say, supportive policy tools or interventions, then it definitely should be looked at as an option.
Okay, great. We have a question. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. This person is wondering how you were defining allyship.
Thank you for that question. And I think as it relates to reconciliation, one of the things for me personally that came out as a researcher is that I had to start my own reconciliation journey to, you know, confront my own biases, my own, I would say, thinking, ways of doing and seeing Indigenous peoples, and also the concerns and plight of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, I preface this by saying I'm not Indigenous myself, and as an ally, having a definition for allyship, it's a very personal thing. It's a very personal journey, reconciliation. However, I think it's important for us to, one, have truth, to acknowledge and recognize the harm that has been caused collectively as a community, as a Canadian society, and two, to have reconciliation first on a personal level and on a corporate level so that we can start to seek to engage Indigenous communities. So, you know, in terms of defining what allyship is, that will mean different things to different people. But to me personally, it first started with my own personal journey. And secondly, seeing how can I contribute, whether it is to the discussion or to alleviate some of the harm that has been caused.
All right, great. Thanks, Candice. We have another question here from Jane. Can you expand further on what you mean by visible symbolic actions? Does this include artwork as well as employing Indigenous people?
That's a great question, Jane, and that's something that came up in this study repeatedly. Um, the organizations that I interviewed, they were very, I would say, mindful of the use of both Indigenous artwork, um, how it is they use Indigenous language, and they actually utilize consultants. They also consulted with Indigenous elders. For example, Affinity Credit Union, has a wide network and their own tribal council representatives that they would consult with on these matters. Um, Even that picture that I showed about in Affinity holding up a banner at a reconciliation walk, it can be interpreted as symbolic or tokenistic. And that's one of the concerns that the staff members I interviewed had. There are various elements that they have integrated, but with consultation with Indigenous elders and leaders, and also Indigenous artists and artisans as well. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay, great. No, that's great, Candice. There's some questions coming fast and furious. I'm going to merge a couple. One from Matt, which I think was sent to me in accident by error, but it's about similar to the question that was just asked. What other policies were influenced or could be influenced by the reconciliation efforts of these credit unions? For example, financial policy or HR policies. And then Art asks a question that I think is a bit similar. What more could credit unions be doing in this space? What about their kind of loan policies, interest rate policies for Indigenous members, contribution to Indigenous events or venues in the communities? So what else is there that could be done, or that you didn't talk about that is being done?
Mhm. Thank you for that question. There are various initiatives that these institutions do, and you're correct. They support Indigenous communities with scholarships. They provide funding to Indigenous institutions as well. They also look at their member council to give them guidance as to what activities they support within Indigenous communities. And they too acknowledge that they could do more, both in terms of their policies and some of their products as it relates to Indigenous communities. Both institutions have been focused on economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities. I would say Affinity may be more advanced in terms of having policies, for example, that apply to unreserved lending. Both institutions do ID clinics and outreach to Indigenous communities. So, the research really covers a lot of the activities that happen within these communities. So you're quite right to say there's a lot more that is happening. However, both acknowledge that a lot more can be done in the economic reconciliation piece in terms of loans to Indigenous businesses, also in terms of building out products that are targeted to Indigenous communities as well. So great question. Professor, you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Candice. I'm going to go to Isabel next, and then Murray had his hand up, so we'll unmute him in a minute. But the question from Isabel is, any thoughts on why the TRC calls mobilized action when the 1996 RCAP did not, even though the report of RCAP clearly established inequities and injustice? So, why now? Why not then, I guess, is the question Isabel is asking.
Thank you so much, Dr. Finley. And I just want to acknowledge Dr. Finley was also on my committee and contributed greatly to this research with her wisdom and insight as well. So in terms of the participants in this study, for them, the TRC survivor stories, I would say that was the key element for them. In terms of UNDRIP, they had limited to no awareness of UNDRIP and some of its predecessors, but those survivor impact stories that was a key element for them that created an internal awareness and an internal reckoning, so to speak, which prompted them now to say, now that we are aware that this has happened, what do we do next? So it was those impact stories, I would say, that was the single greatest catalyst for the participants.
Great, thanks, Candice. There's interesting, I'm just going to comment, then I'll throw to Marie, but it's interesting because I think part of what Isabel might be suggesting is, I would imagine some of those stories would have been around in the early 90s. In fact, I know they were because I was engaged in this area a little bit myself, but they weren't getting the media attention or the sustained attention that they did later on. So that's there's something that did change that I think more than the stories matter, of course, but the fact that they were getting out there and reaching people also seems to be important as well. Murray, go ahead, defend yourself.
Yeah. First of all, Candice, thank you very much. That was interesting. Maybe this is kind of my question sort of picks up on that same area that Isabel was asking about and Marc-Andre was commenting on. My question is, how does moral suasion, what role does moral suasion play in changing values and goals within a society? There is this change that goes on over time in the things that we think are important. And is moral suasion a key part of this, or is it perhaps, does it follow along and come along at the end after other things have happened, and it consolidates some things or highlights them, but maybe it's not the main feature at changing values? I don't know. I'm curious. That is my question to you.
Thank you, Professor, for that question. It's very interesting when you look at moral suasion as a policy tool because of that voluntary element. So on one hand, there's this ethical appeal, and on the other hand, there is this response, this voluntary response that is required. I do believe that there are various elements that do have to come into play for moral suasion to be, I would say, catalyzed, for it to really create that movement. And specifically, we chose to look at, the cooperative sector. One of the reasons, because of cooperative values, that in itself predisposes these institutions to behave in a certain way. Now, there is an interesting thought there that how would moral suasion behave with institutions or organizations who do not have the same values or moral compass, so to speak. And I think we can see this in how, especially TRC 92, how unevenly it is, I would say, how unevenly institutions respond to it or organizations respond to it. You do have, some organizations who, will close, on Truth and Reconciliation Day. They will wear their orange shirts, but that's it. And you have organizations like Affinity and like Synergy who have made various steps to, sign various, I would say, not treaties, but in terms of relationship building activities within the community and reach out. So there are a number of elements, yes, that do have to take place within the society. Also, I think that the Canadian society in general, there is an element there of social conscience. But what about another society that, may not have that high social conscience? Moral suasion, may not be as applicable there, or the effectiveness would not be as great, I would say. So I hope I've answered your question.
There's an interesting thread here of causality. I think I kind of get the sense that Marie and Isabel and even myself have been asking all along, what's causing what? And there is, you can imagine, and then the cooperative angle is really interesting because you could imagine a credit union or other cooperative that's anchored in a community that has no time for reconciliation and does absolutely nothing, right? Because its membership is not supportive, doesn't believe in it, whatever. And so you kind of have to, there's a lot of threads that kind of are coming together here to kind of tell this story. We have a question from Jeremy here. Or is it a comment or statement? I'm going to ask it. I'm going to read it aloud and we'll figure it out. Apathy could arguably weaken and lessen the usefulness of moral suasion. Should public servants be screened for empathy to ensure that influential policymakers are indeed invested in the public interest? Whoa, good, interesting question, Jeremy. Yeah, go ahead. Candice,
Yes, that's quite a heavy one. I would like to use a term that Professor Marc-Andre uses. He would say that, cooperatives are one of the policy tools within your policy portfolio. And I would say moral suasion should act in the same way. In a similar way that policymakers may not use or think of cooperatives as being vehicles in which can really help their policy objectives. Moral suasion is also one of the lesser used or lesser known policy tools. So I would say in terms of empathy, that's very subjective. However, as a policymaker and as a policy professional, our goal is to show that there are other policy tools out there that can be used to achieve policy objectives, especially where relationship building is required, where you cannot use regulations or, forceful laws or incentives. Look at moral suasion.
So Candice, just to be blunt, does that mean that we should have people in government who are kind of a baseline empathy or not? I think because that's Jeremy's question. It's like, should we have a screening process for people who have, no empathy? Like you're out because you're never going to do that engagement community. You're going to think you know all the answers and you're just going to apply them regardless. Or does your research presume some necessary minimum of empathy at the policymaker level?
The research presumes that there are some values there that will support, a policy tool like moral suasion being effective. Bringing it back to, cooperative values, definitely, that provided fertile ground for these institutions to move forward. And I think the same would apply for policymakers. If you do have policymakers who have more empathy, and are, probably on their reconciliation journey themselves, they would be looking at other ways to implement policy objectives. So yes, I'd agree with you to an extent.
There's one more empathy-based question here. And then I think we'll wrap it up. There seems to be a certain amount of, this is from Matt, there seems to be a certain amount of anti-empathy sentiment in Canadian society today, so for anti-woke, anti-DEI, et cetera. How do you think that might shape the willingness of a policymaker to contemplate moral suasion as a policy instrument? And what do you think it means for cooperatives? So a two-part question. What about policymakers? If you buy the presumption that there's this kind of rejection of empathy, does that have implications for how we think about it from a policy perspective, moral suasion? And what about cooperatives?
Thanks for that question, Matt. I think as a policymaker, you always have to consider public sentiment. That's always an element that you will include. However, at the end of the day, you are going to be motivated by, your objectives, whether, those objectives are your federal mandate or your provincial mandate to get those policies completed. So I do believe that, yes, there is public sentiment out there, very anti-immigrant, anti-Indigenous people, all minority groups may feel some of that as well. So it is a reality that you need to consider as a policymaker when you're really developing these policy initiatives. For the cooperative sector, one of the interesting things that came out of the study is that the leaders of these institutions really came out very strongly to say that we do have members that do not agree with our stance on, closing on National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Or even when we send out a pride email, they may email us and say, this is not relevant to me. However, in terms of cooperative values, all of them were unanimous in saying that or cooperative values are synonymous with reconciliation and by extension, Indigenous values. So this is a path that we're on. We invite you to join us, but we will continue on this path. So I believe that for the institutions who have committed to reconciliation as a part of their journey, they're committed because they see cooperative values being synonymous with reconciliation. So I think as a sector, it's very bright in terms of what can be done. The outlook is very positive. And if these examples are highlighted, then I believe that, it will spark interest with more credit unions to act in a formal way and do more in their reconciliation journey.
Well said, Candice. One thing just in concluding that really struck me about Candice's work and then my broader engagement in the credit union sector, just how much they really dug in on this reconciliation process, however imperfectly. If you look at, as Candice was alluding to, if you have been engaged with other organizations, you don't see that in quite the way that we are seeing it in credit union land. And I think that's to be applauded overall. So thank you so much, Candice. This was a really great conversation. It went in all sorts of really fun directions. There's so much more that could be done in this space. Thank you again for doing this, for applying for the scholarship, and for being my student the last couple of years. So just to conclude, a couple of quick announcements. We're actually adjudicating applications for the 2025 Fredeen Scholarship. I've seen the applications. They're very good. So we're going to have a really stellar candidate next year, I'm sure, just like we did this year. And so watch for that announcement in the next week or two. Then I want to just draw your attention to a couple of upcoming talks. We have our annual Ian McPherson talk coming up. And this year we're featuring Dr. Marie Bouchard from the University de Quebec à Montréal. She is a high-profile cooperative researcher known around the world, a friend to many of our scholars here at the center. And she's going to talk about her work at the current, looking at the current state of social and solidarity economic research, and provide some thought-provoking suggestions on where that research could go. We hope you can join us in person or online. She's a fantastic speaker, just a bright light in a sometimes dark world. I hope you'll enjoy it. Second, for those of you who are in Saskatoon, on Friday, we're hosting Kelly Story. She's the executive director of La Siembra Worker Cooperative. They're the people who make the Camino chocolate. If you've had the pleasure of eating Camino chocolate, this is where you go. This is where it comes from. And they're a fair trade worker cooperative that partner with a lot of smallholder farmers in the global south, and they do amazing work. So we're gonna have some free pizza, probably some chocolate bars, and just an interesting talk with Kelly. This is in person only on Friday. And then finally on December 3rd, our very own Stan Yu will be talking about his preliminary findings from a survey of Canadians, at least from Ontario West. I don't know how many we got from Atlantic Canada, on participation in youth co-op camps. So those camps, for those of you who don't know, existed for decades. They've lost a little bit of oomph in the last 10 years or so. So this survey is kind of meant to kind of bring back some attention to this question of what's going on. What did these camps do for people who attended? How can we think about reimagining them for the future? So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today for the 2025 Fredeen Lecture. Thank you to the Fredeen family for supporting this scholarship. Thank you for Candice for a great talk. We hope to see you at future events. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.